hands. All right, so we're going to jump right into this tonight. I'm going to be rather simple tonight in what I talk about. I'm not going to have you turning here, there, and everywhere and doing a bunch of Bible gymnastics. I'm going to just talk tonight about some of the moral and philosophical problems with the concept of hell, specifically the concept of the eternal conscious torment model of hell. Okay? So, let me make my opening statement. Here it is. There is no hell, but most of us live in it. There is no hell, but most of us live in it. Therefore, it is not hell from which we need saving, but the God concept that gives existence to the non-existent. Hell, as we've imagined it, simply does not exist, and I don't even need to exegete a single text for you in order to prove that. All I need to do is look at the cross and see the greatest crime that could be committed, having been committed, and it being met with kindness. That's really as far as I even need to go. We commit deicide. We take breath from the one who gave us ours, and with his dying breaths, he's exhaling forgiveness. That right there answers the question for me, period. I really don't need to even go beyond that. We will, but I don't really need to. So I can say with confidence that at the very least, hell, as we've imagined it and taught it for so many centuries, does not exist. But simply because something doesn't exist doesn't mean it lacks the power to torment us. Something doesn't need to be real in order for us to be able to experience it as reality. And so hell does not exist, but most of us live in it because still in the back of our minds we believe in it. Because we hold on to it just in the name of being cautious. Because better safe than sorry kind of deal, you know? I'd rather kind of hold on to it than completely let go of it in case I'm wrong because, so it's one of those things. So you can even formally renounce that such a place exists and still have the belief at work in you. You can renounce it, you can talk amongst your friends as though you don't believe in it and still have that belief functioning in your life on a certain level. The British illusionist and mentalist Darren Brown in one of his TV specials he did called How to Convert an Atheist, in which he literally brings an atheist to a place of conversion, as the title suggests, to the point where she is, and he's an atheist himself. He's not actually trying to convert her to Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. He's simply trying to prove how easy it is to manipulate people, and it is. And so he literally brings her to this place of tearful conversion where she really believes she had a genuine God encounter, and maybe she did. But he wasn't actually preaching the gospel, he was just manipulating her. And so anyways, I remember I watched that program right before. This was still when I was in revival preacher mode a little bit, and I was preaching grace mixed with that revivalist style, where I was still doing high-intensity altar calls, where I used to want you to weep and cry and feel like you were a scumbag who needed salvation. Now I just wanted you to weep and cry and have this overwhelming experience where you felt like you were still a scumbag, but God loved you anyways. So it was still a lot of the same kind of manipulative emotional tactics. I didn't know I was using them, but still I kind of was. And I remember watching this just before an hour before I went to preach at a church where I was going to be preaching in that vein, and I just didn't even know how to function after I saw this. So thanks a lot to the Brits for destroying my life. And but anyways, in this same program, he opens it up by pulling random unbelievers, atheists from the crowd. Not random, I don't remember how it was all, I'm sure they were vetted, I don't know how it was all arranged, but he has them come up, they all, just announce they don't believe in God, they're not superstitious individuals, they don't believe in any of this stuff, and yet he has them, he asks who of them would be willing to recite from this book of satanic curses, and take a knife and stab it into a picture of their loved ones while reciting these verses from this satanic, book, which would be, tantamount to them cursing their family. And these are all atheists, super atheists. They don't believe in any of this stuff. They think it's all nonsense. And yet, I don't think nary a one of them were willing to do it, maybe one or two. And they're atheists. Why? Because we can formally renounce a belief in something, But in the name of surviving, in the name of feeling safe, that belief can still be functioning within us. And we might be completely unconscious of the fact that it's functioning, right? Because we are a species that has survived as long as we have, because we're a species that's bent on surviving. And so whatever it takes to survive, that's what we do. Our ancestors are those who, went to great lengths to survive. Whatever it took, they did. We inherited their genes. That's why we still behave that way. Only now it's not about avoiding lions in the savannah. It's about believing certain ways in order to whatever. So that's just how we function. So if it makes us feel safe to believe something, we'll believe it, even if we formally renounce a belief in it. And so this thing can still be functioning within us, even though we would completely disavow the belief if we were asked. But the fact that it still functions inside of us means that on some level, we're still tormented and haunted by it. Now, if you are like an atheist or someone who is, really convinced that this doesn't exist, you've obviously looked into it, and you obviously have some information that you've gathered that's caused you to renounce the belief, and yet it still functions. What you need is the belief that you need to be saved from that belief, from that place or that thing to be dealt with, not just to fill your head full of facts on why this thing or that thing or the other thing can't exist. So let me explain it to you this way. I think I'm going to manage to squeeze 2 Twilight Zone illustrations into this message tonight if I play my cards right. So, let's begin by talking about Uncle Simon and the death of God. There's an episode of The Twilight Zone called Uncle Simon. Any other Twilight Zone fans in the house? Yes, the 3 of you who are all older than me, but it's okay. I'm just nobody my age likes The Twilight Zone. That's why you're all going to hell. So, anyways, there's this episode called Uncle Simon. And in this episode, there's a character named Uncle Simon who is a crotchety old jerk. And his niece, Barbara, has been waiting on him hand and foot for the last 25 years. He injured himself something like 25 years prior, and she moved in with him to take care of him. Now, the reason she moved in with him to take care of him was because she wanted to inherit his estate when he finally, passed on. And so she served him for 25 years, awaiting the day he would, kick the bucket and she could, cash in on that thing. And so she's been waiting patiently. Her drab appearance, tells the story of a woman who's endured 25 years worth of hell because Uncle Simon is a maniac. He's constantly belittling her and berating her. He's verbally abusive and, whatever. He's also an inventor, so he spends a lot of time down in his lab creating things and demanding that Barbara bring him hot chocolate in a specific mug prepared a certain way. So that's Uncle Simon, and that's Barbara. During one particularly heated exchange between Uncle Simon and Barbara, which happens at the top of a flight of stairs, it's never a good idea to get into a heated exchange with someone at the top of a flight of stairs. He lifts his cane to strike her, but he's old and frail, and she catches, she deflects the blow, but he loses his balance and he goes tumbling down the stairs and he dies. Now, in the next scene, you would expect that maybe she's going to be living, high on the hog now. She's inherited his estate and all is well. But that's not the way things go down. The lawyer comes and talks to her and says, look, you're in his will. You're going to inherit the whole thing, but there's a couple stipulations. You can never leave the house again, and you have to care for his latest invention. She doesn't know what his latest invention is, so she agrees to the terms a little bit grudgingly, and they go and they unearth his latest invention, and it's this big, 1960s Lost in Space-esque looking robot that's been programmed to behave exactly as Uncle Simon did in life. And so in order to inherit the estate, she can't leave the house, and she has to care for the needs of this thing. And so at first it speaks in a very monotone kind of robotic voice, and it's like, Barbara, bring me hot chocolate, But then it begins to evolve and grow throughout the course of the episode until it speaks exactly as Uncle Simon, and it sounds exactly as Uncle Simon. So here, her Uncle Simon dies, but then he reappears in another form in her life, right? He falls down the stairs, he succumbs to his old age and irrelevancy, tumbles to his death, but then he reappears in another form. And so now, there's this particularly heated exchange that occurs between Barbara and Uncle Simon 2.0, and Uncle Simon 2.0 calls her, and I quote, a peanut-headed example of nature's mistakes. And she loses it, and this time pushes Uncle Simon 2.0 down the stairs. He doesn't just succumb to his frailty and his old age and irrelevancy. She pushes him deliberately down the stairs. Now, in the next scene, you'd expect maybe he's finally been dealt with. Maybe she's going to inherit the estate, whatever. But no, in the next scene, Barbara standing looking, haggard in the front room, and Uncle Simon comes hobbling out of the kitchen with a leg brace on, leaning on a cane, yelling at Barbara to prepare him hot chocolate in a specific mug, prepared a certain way, in a very human-sounding voice, to which she replies in a very robotic-sounding voice, "Yes, Uncle." And I think what we have an example of here is how we might really think we've gotten beyond a God concept, but we haven't, because it continually reappears in different forms. So for a while, I believed in this God of hellfire and brimstone, the God of Jonathan Edwards, who dangles us over the fires of hell like a child dangles a spider above, whatever, all this kind of hellish imagery. I believed in this God. I preached and I proclaimed this God. I won people over to this God who are in ministry today telling other people about this God. I really believed in him. But the longer you live, the harder it becomes to serve that God. Eventually, he begins to succumb to irrelevancy and to his old age. You don't have to push this God down the stairs. All you've got to do is read a few books and open your eyes and listen to some teachers who, see things from a perspective that's a little bit outside of your camp. And you don't even have to push this thing down the stairs. It just falls down the stairs on its own. And you finally feel like you're rid of it. I'm rid of this God of hellfire and brimstone who torments me, literally torments me with nightmares at night. I can't even have a good night's rest without dreaming about a loved one of mine burning in hell. That punk, okay? I finally feel like I'm rid of him. Woo! And then I embrace this thing called grace. And I'm living this grace thing out now. I'm preaching this grace thing. And suddenly I began to realize this is the same dude. This is Uncle Simon. He simply reappeared in another form. It is the exact same God. The only difference is this God has had his wrath gland neutered and he's on atoning antidepressants and he's in a little bit of a better mood. But it's still the same mythological, blood sacrifice demanding deity who roasts his enemies forever in hell if they don't pronounce his name right or recite a certain creed or whatever, or bend their knee at a magic altar somewhere. It's the same God. The only difference now is that, Jesus has fed him the ultimate sacrificial snack, and so his bloodlust has been satiated. And so as long as I believe on Jesus and say the right words, confess the right thing, he's not angry at me anymore. And you say things like, there's no more wrath for the believer. But there is still wrath. We're just saved from it because we're dressed up in an Esau costume and we fooled our dumb, blind, ailing father into thinking we're a firstborn when we're really just a heel-grabbing Jacob underneath our cheap Halloween costume. And we call that being in Christ. It's the same God. It's the same idol I thought fell down the stairs. He simply reappeared in another form. And so eventually I began to see this. And this time, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. He wasn't going to fall down on his own. I had to push this God down. And because certain things happened in my life, I got really angry for a season because certain things that happened, and I tried to just become an atheist while I was pastoring. Now, that's just me being honest, okay? And believe me, most pastors go through the same thing. They're just not going to tell you that, okay? So I started reading, atheistic literature, everything from Nietzsche to Richard Dawkins and everything in between, okay? And from philosophical atheism to the new angsty brand of atheism, I just got fed up, It's like, there's got to be something better than this. And so then, I felt like I pushed this thing down the stairs inside, in my heart. I wouldn't have confessed it publicly yet, but I felt like I finally dealt with this. So I tried to be an atheist, but I realized I couldn't be an atheist. And I don't mean that in like the snarky evangelical way of, I tried to be an atheist, but, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, what with all this evidence demanding a verdict. If you grew up an evangelical, you got the reference, and congrats. I don't mean I tried, but I couldn't because there was just too much evidence pointing, in the opposite direction. I mean, I couldn't because atheism became my new God. God reappeared in the form of atheism. And what I mean by that is that when I say God, I'm talking about something that I believed could save me from something that I was trying to escape. Now, in my case, I was simply trying to escape life as it was. I wanted a being who could, take me higher, whatever, introduce me to a better way of living than I was living at that time. And so anything that offers you that is a god. Anything that offers you that is an idol. And so you can keep pushing the source of your salvation down the stairs, but it will constantly reappear in your life until you deal with the desire for salvation. The real problem isn't Uncle Simon. The real problem is with Barbara's desire to inherit his estate. She could have been free of his tyranny years ago had she just simply said, I don't need it, and left it behind. She could have been free of him. Uncle Simon 2.0 would have never entered her life had she just decided, I don't need the salvation that Uncle Simon offers. But because she could not let go of that need for salvation, Uncle Simon continued to reappear in her life over and over again. And that end scene of him standing on a cane is just sort of a reminder to her that no matter what you do, I'll always bounce back. The real thing that needs to be dealt with is the desire for salvation. Now, salvation is something that takes many forms. We're talking about hell tonight, so I'm talking about the God who saves us from God. The God who saves us from his own wrath, the God who prepares this cosmic concentration camp in which he will fry us in our own fat forever and ever and ever. That's the myth we all grow up hearing. And it's just there. And even when we mature a little bit and that thing tumbles down the steps, it just reappears. It just keeps reappearing. What we need to deal with is the issue from which we think we need saving. And when we deal with that, when we see the doctrine of hell for the ridiculous thing that it is, in light of the full revelation of God in Jesus on the cross, it simply ceases, it just disappears. And the God of that place disappears. You don't have to push him downstairs. You don't have to fight him anymore. When you deal with the thing from which you think he can save you, he just simply disappears. And you can get on with this thing called living that so few of us in the church have ever experienced. So hell does not exist, but most of us live in it. Therefore, it is not hell from which we need saving, but the God concept that turns that keeps the non-existent coming into existence. So let's just there's so much I'd like to say, but we've got 2 sessions tomorrow and 1 on Sunday in which we can talk about some of this stuff too. So let me talk to you about a few things for a moment. Now, I told you I'm not going to go too deep and be too technical. I'm not going to bring out like 1,000,001 scriptures tonight. I'm just going to talk through some of the moral and philosophical problems with the concept of hell. Okay, so are you ready to get into this? And I promise to not go too long. I'm glad one of you was ready. I think I heard someone blow air through their nose when I said, anybody ready? And so whoever that was, thank you. Anybody else ready to go into this a little bit more? Okay, so it's go time. So not too long ago, probably about 2 years ago, I killed a mouse. Now, the truth is, I live in a semi-rural area with an open field that butts up to the back of my property, and that open field just kind of is teeming with little field mice. And so every now and again, they make their way indoors. Well, about 2 years ago, I woke up every morning and saw evidence of mouse activity going on in my house, and I realized I had a big problem, and I had to rid my home of this invading horde. And so I went to war. I went to Walmart. I went to anywhere that would sell things with which I could kill mice. And I bought everything. I filled up my cart with glue traps, the sticky traps, the more traditional snap traps, the poison traps, everything that they had, I bought. And I booby-trapped the crap out of my house. There's mouse. I'm still finding them in places I don't even remember I put them there. It's like everywhere. I am, and then every night I would commission my 2 cats to watch over the home in my absence, and they would, and I would hear squeaking and going on in the middle of the night, and I'd come down and there'd be a beheaded mouse laying on the kitchen floor, and we had a problem. We've since dealt with it, but it was a rough time. And so the truth is, I've probably killed many mice in my tenure as a husband and defender of my home. But 2 years ago, I killed a mouse, and it was a little bit different than all of those other ones. On this occasion, I walked in on one of my cats in mid-murder, and cats don't just kill a mouse, they torture it. They CIA this thing. They're waterboarding it. They're everything they can do. They love to hear it squeal. They derive great pleasure from this. And so my cat was down there doing his thing, and the mouse is like, wee, wee, wee. My cat's just just loving it. And my wife was like, oh my God, Jeff, you got to do something about it. It's suffering. You got to do something about it. So I'm like, I've got 3 options. I can let my cat finish the job. I can take the mouse and throw it out into the front yard and let it slowly die of its injuries. Neither of those 2 options seemed like good options. Or I could just kill it quickly and put it out of its misery. It wasn't going to make it, okay? I promise. I knew what I had to do, so I scooped the thing up and I took it outside and in the most humane way possible, put it out of its misery. Now, the truth is, he actually probably died a much less painful death than the several mice that got stuck on the glue traps. Can you imagine a worse way of going than getting stuck on a glue trap and just sitting there until you die? I mean, how long does that even take? I mean, I did the deed quickly, just and it was over with, But this one haunted me. I'm sorry for animal lovers if this is making you, okay. But this one haunted me. In fact, I had to go speak that evening after I killed this mouse, and I could not get it out of my head. I ended up talking about it, but I didn't yet have a talk prepared around it. So I just got up and stupidly began talking about this mouse I killed, and at the end I'm like, all right, open your Bibles to Matthew, whatever. It haunted me. I couldn't get it out of my mind. At night, I would see its black little beady eyes staring up at me, pleading for mercy, It haunted me. But again, I've killed many mice before. I've set many traps and caused a lot of mice a lot of pain and suffering. And this one was quite humane and quick, but this one haunted me and those didn't. Why did this one haunt me and the others did not? I think it could be answered by a couple hypothetical scenarios that moral philosophers sometimes lay out. One called the trolley problem and one called the problem of the fat man. So we'll explain these. The trolley problem is a moral dilemma sort of situation that audiences are presented with, in which you're walking down, you're walking alongside a set of train tracks, and there are 5 people tied up to the tracks, and there is a train barreling toward them at full speed, and it can't be stopped. Okay? It's going to hit them unless you flip a switch, which will divert the train down another set of tracks onto which is tied one person. So people are going to die no matter what you do. But if you let the train continue in its present course, it's going to kill 5 people. But if you flip the switch, it's only going to kill 1. Someone is still going to die, but less people are going to die if you flip the switch. Now, when presented with this scenario, most people in an audience agree that flipping the switch in this situation would be the moral thing to do. It would be difficult, it wouldn't be easy, but it would be the moral decision to make because you're saving more life than is being taken. So most people don't have a problem with that. But here's the next scenario. You're walking along a footbridge this time. That is, there's train tracks running beneath you and you're walking above it, right? And so an out of control like train is again barreling towards 5 people who are tied to the tracks. And they're going to die unless something is done. This time, there's no flip to switch. You can't divert the train down another set of tracks. You have to put a large object in the path of the train. Now, there just happens to be a very large man walking on the footbridge right next to you, and he just happens to be large enough that he would be able to stop the train. So it still comes down to a matter of 5 people dying or 1 person dying. Only this time, you don't flip a switch. You have to push a man in front of a train. You do it, 1 person dies, 5 people live. When presented with this scenario, most people in an audience would say it would be absolutely immoral to do that. It would be absolutely immoral to push the man from the footbridge into the path of the oncoming train. While most will agree that it would be the moral decision to flip the switch and divert the train towards 1 instead of allowing it to kill 5. It's still 1 life for 5, but why are the scenarios so different? They're so different because in one, you're not directly bringing harm to anyone, you're simply flipping a switch. But in the other one, you have to put your hands on someone and you have to be actively involved in their death. And there's something up in our brains that just resists that idea. And so, I killed a mouse and it bothered me. But I killed a lot of mice, and it didn't bother me. Because in one scenario, I'm just simply setting traps, but in the other one, I have to actually in some way use my hands to do it directly. Now, I think this explains why we preach and why we teach people that there is a hell and that it is a place of eternal separation from God. How many times have you heard it taught that hell is a place of separation from God? And the worst thing about hell, brother, it isn't going to be the flames. It ain't going to be the recordings that are going to be playing on loop in your head for all of eternity of every altar call you resisted and every sermon you plugged your ears to. It ain't going to be any of that. And believe me, it's going to be bad. But the real torment is in the fact that God is nowhere to be found, friend. You cry to him, and his ears are deaf to your cries, because hell is a place of separation, and that's where the real torment is. How many of you guys ever heard that idea? That hell is a place of eternal separation from God. God is not present in hell. It's a place of separation from him. Why do we teach that? You would think, with as often as we hear it, that there are just a mountain of proof texts to back it up. But there aren't. In fact, I don't really see anywhere in Scripture that you can actually, I don't see any instance in the Bible that you could pull out and use it to, justify this belief that hell is a place of eternal separation from God. Here are a few, okay? You've got 2 Thessalonians 1:9, which says they will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. Firstly, this isn't one of the genuine Pauline epistles, so this is not something you have to try to, make gel with Paul's eschatology, which is very universalist. So you don't have to say, well, this is also Paul, and Paul also said this, so Paul believed this. This is not likely one of the genuine Pauline epistles. 1 Thessalonians is, 2 Thessalonians is debatable. So that's the first issue. The second issue is, if you read it in context, this is not about hell as we think of hell today. Because for us today, hell, you die, you're an unbeliever, you go there. Here the author is talking about a belief that in some way God was going to step in his generation and put a stop to the persecution that the church in that era was experiencing. And it said, those who trouble you will be paid back with trouble. So this isn't talking about being separated from God eternally in hell. This was a man who had a belief that in his day, God was going to intervene and put a stop to the persecution that the church was experiencing. This is not about hell. There's no way to make this be about hell unless you completely change your view of hell. But our problem is we come with a set of beliefs, and then we feed everything we read into them, right? That's what we do. We already have a bunch of stuff we believe. We believe in original sin. We believe God prepared a place of torment for those who don't turn to Jesus and all this kind of stuff. And then everything else we read in Scripture, everything else we read in the text, we simply feed into that which we already believe and we make it match what we believe. So that's what we do here. We already come at the text with a belief that hell is a place of eternal separation from God, and we come to this text and we're like, well, there it is. That's what it's all about. This is not about hell. We cannot make it about hell. This is about something completely different. Okay? So let's move on from there. If you go to Revelation chapter 14, this is where so much of the church's hell imagery is drawn from, right? Lake of fire, smoke of their torment rising forever and ever and ever, and all that kind of good stuff, right? Listen to what it says here, Revelation 14, 9 through 11. I'm not even going to take the time right now tonight to talk about what this may or may not be about. I'm just going to read it. Okay? It says, then another angel, a third, followed them, crying with a loud voice, those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands. Mark of the beast. Was I the only one who was like fully prepared for the mark of the beast as a child? Like, my plan was, I am going to have to cut off some like Antichrist soldier's arm or hand and like just wear long sleeve shirts all the time and kind of like rig up some kind of device where I can just have it like dangling there. So when I want like Mountain Dew and some Doritos, I can just be like, beep, and I can survive the tribulation that way. And when it starts to rot, you just go find another one. So in order to survive the tribulation, I have to become a serial killer who keeps right hands as his trophy. So it wasn't going to go well for me either way during the tribulation, but anyways, I got to get back on track. It says, they will also drink of the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur. Now, that is a verse we use to describe hell, right? But then it goes on to say, in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. It doesn't say outside of the presence of the holy angels and outside of the presence of the Lamb. It says whatever this thing is, whatever the author has in mind here, it's something that occurs in the presence of God, not outside of it. Okay? Now, the only other real text I could think someone could even use is, maybe Matthew 7, where Jesus says, depart from me. And so they could say, well, that indicates a separation. But the violence you're doing to the text and making that mean hell is a place of eternal separation from God it's just such a stupid way of interpreting the text. I'm not even going to comment on it. That's just not what it's about. Okay? Let's see, where else? Psalms 139, right? Even if I descend into the depths of Sheol, you're there, right? Those who believe in eternal conscious torment in this place of fire and torture in the center of the earth often interpret Old Testament passages dealing with Sheol or the grave as being about hell. And yet the psalmist says that even in Sheol, God is present. So you just can't use Sheol to describe hell and at the same time declare that hell is a place of eternal separation from God when the psalmist says that God is present in Sheol. So here's the thing. It's just not there. The idea that hell is a place of eternal separation from God is something that we came up with. It's an idea, it's a belief we have constructed. It's not something we've built using this mountain of proof text. There's really only a few that are even there, and even them we've taken out of context, but we've constructed this idea. But something moved us to construct this idea. What was it? Why did we construct it in the first place? I think it goes back to the mouse problem and the trolley problem. We're okay with a lever-pulling, trap-setting God, but we're not okay with a God who is actively involved in the torment of billions and billions of people. And so we seek to separate him from it by saying hell is a place of eternal separation from his presence. Because if he is present, it must mean that he is somehow involved in the suffering and torment of billions and billions of people. And not just in suffering and torment that lasts like a human lifetime, but something that never ends. He's not just tormenting them. He's also supernaturally keeping them alive so that the party never ends. And something in us rejects this. Something in us knows better. Something in us knows that if a God like that does exist, he's no God at all, but a devil. And so we have to construct some sort of doctrine that will allow us to separate us from that place while still keeping the place. Because we're okay with a God who sets a trap that we fall into. We're okay with a God who maybe turns his head and pushes a button or pulls a lever, but a God who has his hands in the thing and who's actually causing people harm. Most humans who aren't psychotic have a problem with that. And so we separate him from it because we cannot rightly worship a God who is doing that. At the same time, our hands are raised singing, "How great is our God." You guys still with me? So now some try to wiggle out of this by saying, well, hell was not originally prepared for humans. This is what you're misunderstanding. Matthew 25:41, I think, says that hell was originally prepared for the devil and his angels. Tomorrow we'll talk about the parable of the sheep and the goats and what that probably does not mean. Okay? But we've taken this verse and we've said, no, see what's going on is God is telling us that he never prepared hell for human beings because God's not like that. He prepared hell for Satan and his fallen angels, and they were supposed to be tormented there day and night and day forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And it's only when we became sinners and took on the nature of the one for whom this place was prepared that it became a place where we go if we die as unbelievers as well. Now, number one, that's a complete butchering of the parable of the sheep and the goats. That's not at all what Jesus is trying to do. He's not trying to give us hell's origin story. Being like, by the way, while I wrap up this epic parable about social injustice and all this kind of stuff, let me also, real quick, just give you a description of where hell came from. And you can, I'm going to say it in one sentence, and I want you to take this and build your entire doctrine of hell off of it, okay? That's not what's going on, okay? But let's say that's true. Let's just say for a moment it's true, and that hell was not originally designed with humans in mind. It was only designed with rebellious angels and Satan in mind. Does that really make it any better? Because if this is a place outfitted with the means of inflicting eternal torment on people, it means that those for whom it was created have the capacity to be tormented forever. So even if they are evil, fallen angels, God still would have created a place designed to do nothing but cause harm to beings that can feel and emote forever and ever and ever with no redemptive purpose. Where is holiness in that? Where is love in that? Where is where is anything redeemable in that at all? That doesn't make it any better just simply by saying it was originally created for somebody much worse than us. Would Auschwitz be any more glamorous if there was a time in the Nazi Party's history where they were a little nicer and they originally, created these death camps for criminals and pedophiles? And originally they were designed for people like that, where they were just going to fool them into thinking they were taking a shower and we're going to gas them or vaporize them in ovens and treat them in the most horrendous of ways. These places were originally created for really bad people, and it's only after the Nazi Party kind of lost their marbles that they started using them on the innocent. Would that change in any way your understanding of the people who created the place? They still created a place outfitted with the means of harming human beings in the most horrendous of ways. No matter how askew those people's moral compasses were, other humans still designed a place that would cause immense harm to other humans for no reason other than simply to cause them harm. The place doesn't become any more beautiful, and those who created them don't become any more loving. The fact is, if such a place exists, the one that created it is demented. And if a hell in which right now billions and billions of people, some of them as young as 12, because apparently that's when you cross the line and pass into the age of accountability. So like 2 years ago, you're spinning around in a princess dress or whatever, and then 2 years later, you are accountable for your own eternity and your own eternal well-being. At 12, you're expected to be able to make a decision, that will determine how literally eternity will pan out, Kids as young as 12 are burning in hell, apparently. If you read Jonathan Edwards, babies are burning in hell. If you read Calvin, there's babies, whatever, in hell. And believing fathers in heaven are having their bliss increased by the sight of their own babies roasting in hell, according to Jonathan Edwards. If a place like that exists, the one who created it, even if he originally created it for someone much worse than you, the one who created it is demented and he's a devil. And he doesn't deserve the upraised hands of human worship. He deserves the upraised fist of human revolution and maybe a middle finger or two. I'm sorry to be blunt, but this is true. And listen, even if this place did exist, it doesn't mean that you must worship the one who created it. That, again, is nothing more than survival. That's the one who joins with the Nazis simply because he doesn't want to be gassed. Might does not make right, and if this God exists, and if he created a place like that, I would rather burn there forever than live forever with him somewhere else, because he is a monster. And I'm sorry, but that's true. I really have a hard time just being blunt and saying how I actually feel about things. So, but the truth is, guys, we know better, and so we seek to remove God from this place. We're always trying to get him off the hook, right? Well, he's separate from it. Or this place wasn't originally designed for humans. It was designed for someone much worse than us. None of that stuff matters. None of that stuff changes. Listen, if hell exists independent of God, then hell is a godlike creature. If it has existence outside of the one who gives all things existence, then it's not dependent or relying on him for its existence. Therefore, it is a God itself. So if a hell exists from which God is separate, you are a polytheist. An idol worshiper of sorts, who will yourself end up burning forever in one of your idols. If you follow that logic. The fact is, this place cannot exist unless God is directly involved in all that goes on within it. It cannot have an existence outside of him. Okay, let's keep going here. You guys still with me? Now, no? Okay, I thought you said no. I was like, oh man. I'm done. Now, all right. I want to save some things for tomorrow. Okay, here's the facts. There are some who can callously speak of this place without any emotion in their voice when they do it, without any tears falling from their eyes when they describe the torments of the damned. And I can only think to myself, you either don't actually believe it, or you only believe it sometimes, or you're the most immoral human being I've ever had the misfortune of gazing upon. Because if you believe in this place and you can speak of it coldly and mechanically, something is wrong with you. Now, I remember watching a video online a few months back, and it was, that people were making fun of Christians, and they were making fun of how crazy Christians are, and 99.9% of the Christians in this video were crazy. And it was somewhat humorous, but sad at the same time. But there was one guy who was preaching on hell, and he's screaming and bawling his eyes out as he's preaching on hell, and they're just like laughing at him and putting like these, mocking, trollish comments up as the video is playing. I just wept when I watched it, though, because I'm like, this man really believes what he's talking about, or he wouldn't be behaving this way. And you know what? Anyone who claims to believe in hell should behave that way. Because that's the way any decent, moral, upright person would believe if they actually believed that everyone was born damned by default, and unless they prayed a certain prayer, they were going to burn forever and ever and ever in a place of eternal torment. That's the way you should be acting. And so if you claim a belief in hell and you're not constantly vexed by the thought of billions of people burning just miles beneath your feet, and if you are not constantly out on the streets warning people and begging them to come to Jesus, your moral compass is broken. You're unfeeling or you just simply don't believe in it yourself. And I think it's probably a mixture of both, because you see, we can't handle that. We can't handle living in a penthouse on top of Auschwitz. We can't go about our lives being happy, believing that people are being burned and gassed and tormented just a few miles beneath our feet. So we become, very compartmentalized. And we believe in it when we're hearing it proclaimed, when we're in the right setting where actual belief in it is okay, and the preacher preaches on it, and you're kind of allowed to have that moment where you weep and feel a burden or whatever. Or when you're out evangelizing, and then you're allowed to be the hellfire and brimstone preacher. So that's when you slip into that compartment that does believe it. But in order to function as a human being, you also have to have a good chunk of your life where you don't believe it. That is equally immoral. But it also proves how destructive the idea is that you literally have to become almost two persons in order to sustain the belief, or else your life would be destroyed. Now, some people have actually fooled themselves into thinking that this place is good, and they speak of it as though it were good. And you know what? If they're true believers in this place, and they're also true believers that God is good, I almost can't argue with them. Because if you believe God is good and you believe in hell, that has to mean that everything he created is good. And so hell then would have to be good. And the psychotic one in that world, the rebellious one, would actually be the one who pauses and sheds tears over the fate of the damned. The good son, the obedient one, would actually be the one who can applaud God for doing what he's doing to those poor, unfortunate souls, if they actually believe in him and also believe he's good and believe in hell. Let's do a little exercise. Caleb did a contemplative exercise. Let's do one too. Let's close your eyes. Close your eyes. And I want you to just begin to, in your own way, begin to thank God for his goodness. Thank him for providing you with food, for putting a roof over your head. Thank him for the health of your children, for the vehicle you came here in. All the typical things we usually thank God for. Now I want you to change gears, and I want you to begin to thank him for the 17-year-old girl who is burning in hell because she died after having taken her own life because she was abused by her father her whole life. And she died an atheist because she couldn't believe that God could exist if he would allow things like this to happen. Now thank God for the 90-some-year-old man who was vaporized and went up the chimneys of Auschwitz in smoke form, who also died cursing the God of Abraham. Because how could the God of our fathers allow something like this to happen to us? He died experiencing the worst that human beings could dish out, and he's now experiencing the worst that God can dish out. Thank God for their sufferings. Thank God for what he's actively doing to them right now. Are you having a hard time doing that? That's because you're sane. That's because your brain works correctly. If you actually got into it, please check yourself in to the nearest clinic as soon as possible. If you actually were getting into it and you're like, woo, shakaba, woo, please. We'll drive you there. But in the name of your family's safety, we need to get you somewhere fast. That was rather difficult, wasn't it? Because we know better. We know those aren't things to be grateful for and thankful for. We know those aren't reflections of goodness or love. We can't bring ourselves to call something which we know to be evil good. And yet, how can heaven be heaven for the believer unless they are able to call that which we think to be evil now good? How could heaven be heavenly unless we are one day enabled to thank God for the suffering of the damned? Otherwise, it would be hell to be in heaven. Because the suffering of the damned would vex us. Here we are, living in the lap of luxury, and my children are burning. So we must just forget about them. God just wipes our memories. We forget that they ever existed. One pastor used to quote, I can't remember the passage, but somewhere where it says that the breasts that nurse them will forget the ones who go down to Sheol, and he would use that to say that even a mother will forget her child if she goes to heaven and the child goes to hell. Because that's the only way heaven could be heavenly for them. God will wipe all the tears from their eyes, and they won't be able to mourn the fate of those who are suffering in hell. Otherwise, it wouldn't be heaven for them. I remember Paul saying somewhere, 1 Corinthians 13, that love endures all things. Love endures the eschaton. Love endures the revelation of perfection. Love is the one thing that never ceases. Love and empathy are tied together. If you love something, you empathize for it. If you love something or someone, you hurt when they hurt. Right? And love endures forever. How can heaven be a place where love is removed from your life so that you cannot any longer empathize with the pain of those you loved in life if love is something that endures forever? God would have to give you a moral lobotomy. He would have to remove your ability to empathize and feel and love in order for heaven to be a heavenly experience. Otherwise, heaven would be hell. See, everything this doctrine of hell touches becomes hellish, including heaven. Listen to this. Listen to some of these little chestnuts from some of our Christian heroes from yesteryear. Not all of whom are bad people. Some of them were amazing people, geniuses, who wrote a lot of other incredible stuff. But here's Thomas Aquinas. In order that the happiness of the saints may be more delightful to them, and that they may render more copious thanks to God for it, they are allowed to see perfectly the sufferings of the damned, so that they may be urged the more to praise God. Jonathan Edwards, in a sermon with a snappy little title called The Eternity of Hell Torments, writes, "Hereby the saints will be made the more sensible how great their salvation is." In other words, here's how the saints are going to be motivated to thank God for the greatness of their salvation for all of eternity. Here's how it works. When they shall see how great the misery is from which God has saved them, and how great a difference he has made between their state and the state of others who were by nature, and perhaps for a time by practice, no more sinful and ill-deserving than any, it will give them a greater sense of the wonderfulness of God's grace to them every time they look upon the damned. It will excite in them a lively and admiring sense of the grace of God, and making them so to differ. The view of the misery of the damned will double the ardor of the love and gratitude of the saints in heaven. In Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards' most famous sermon, probably one of the most famous sermons in American history, Edwards says this: "The sight of hell torments will exalt the happiness of the saints forever. Can the believing Father in heaven," not talking about our Heavenly Father, but can a believing Father in heaven be happy with his unbelieving children in hell? I tell you, yea, such will be his sense of justice that it will increase rather than diminish his bliss. Not only will you be excited at watching your enemies burn, you will even be excited at watching your own children burn. Elsewhere, I believe it's also in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards says that reprobate infants are vipers of vengeance that spit venom in the face of God, but he holds them over the fires of hell with the tongs of his wrath. Isn't that handy? God just happens to have a little, carrying case full of torture tools, one of them which is called his tongs of wrath, Whenever he comes across a little reprobate baby that needs torturing, he pulls out his trusty wrath tongs and goes to work. And a father in heaven will look down into hell and see his baby and will have his bliss increased by it. So these are characters who are saying God doesn't just wipe our memories so that we can't remember them. He actually somehow causes us to see this torment and torture as a good thing. Something, and not just something that we acknowledge as good, but something that excites us and increases our bliss. See, even heaven becomes hell if this hell exists. You either have all love removed from your life so that you can't empathize with those you love who are hurting, or you are forced to see something that is evil as being good. There's another episode of The Twilight Zone for you. It's called It's a Good Life. And there's this young boy named Anthony who has supernatural, almost godlike powers. Okay? And at the beginning of the episode, I don't remember, it's like the mailman or the milkman or somebody who, comes up and he sees little Anthony creating some kind of little creature, and you can only see the shadow on the wall. And he's like, "Oh, what are you making there, buddy?" And he's like, "Oh," and obviously it's ghastly and disgusting. But he can't say that to Anthony because Anthony has godlike powers. And if you don't agree that what Anthony is doing is good, he'll use his powers against you. So he's like, "Oh, that's really good that you're doing that. It's really good that you're doing that." And he walks away terrified while confessing that what Anthony was doing was good. Later on in the episode, some of the townspeople come over to Anthony's folks' house, and Anthony he's a terror, constantly doing horrendous things, using his godlike powers to kill and destroy and all kinds of stuff. But everybody in the town is afraid of him. They're all held in bondage by fear of Anthony, and they're constantly saying, no matter what he does, "It's good that you did that. It's really good that you did that." At the end, Anthony wishes that it would snow, and it destroys the crops of one of the farmers. I don't know if it was his father or one of the characters in the episode who is a farmer, and it destroys all of his crops. And the episode sort of comes to an end with this guy weeping and crying, his income for the year destroyed, saying, "It's really good that you did that. It's really, really good that you did that." People who are so terrified of this little devil that they have to confess that his evil works are good, because they're afraid of what will happen if they confess the truth about him. So heaven either becomes a place where you really truly become convinced of the fact that what Anthony is doing is good, or you're forced to exist for eternity, fearfully proclaiming that what God is doing is good, even though deep inside you know it's not. Either way, it becomes hell. Everything this doctrine touches becomes hell. And if you think that it's only, ancient preachers who haven't lived for several centuries who believe this way, here's a quote from one of the most popular, Calvinistic preachers of our day, Paul Washer. You ever heard the name? Very popular amongst the Reformed crowd. He says this: "It is not an exaggeration to say that the last thing that the accursed sinner should and will hear when he takes his first step into hell is all of creation standing to its feet and applauding God because he has rid the earth of him." This was written by a man in something like the year 2015. Do you really want to spend eternity with a God who is going to either force you to forget your loved ones and force you to forget the fact that they're suffering and torment? No. Do you want to spend eternity with a God who forces you to say his tormenting of others is good? Or actually convinces you that it's good? No. No one wants to believe that. No one wants to believe that that place exists and a God who sustains such a place exists. So we claim it's a place of separation from him so we can keep the place intact and also feel okay in worshiping this God. But the very fact that we've created a doctrine that doesn't even have a scriptural foundation proves that we know better. Okay, this is going over really well. Okay, I'm going to just come to an end. What time do we have? 8:35. Okay. Let me just bring this in for a close. Are you guys all okay out there? Okay. ISIS, the Islamic State, the epitome of evil in the mind of us Westerners, right? Their atrocities really began being talked about the first time they videotaped and uploaded a recording of them burning a man alive in a cage. You remember that? It's like a year and a half ago, something like that. And the Christian world lost its mind, as did the rest of the world, rightly so. This is horrendous. This is evil. Let's elect a president who will bomb the hell out of them, who will send them back to where they came from. Let's kill their family members. Let's make the desert glow, right? because we know what an atrocious thing that is. Right? And so we want to see them pay. Yet think about this. The person, at least in that first instance, who they burned was a Muslim. Just wasn't radical enough for them. But a Muslim, nonetheless. Now, according to evangelical Christian doctrine, the second his soul escaped his charred body, God locked him in a cage and set him on fire. Only this time he did not have the sweet relief of death to look forward to, because this God would supernaturally sustain his existence so that the party would never end. And yet we have the audacity to point our fingers at ISIS and call for their heads, and then we turn right around and lift our hands and sing praises to the God who a second later is doing far worse to this man than anything ISIS did to this man. We go from bomb them back to hell where they came from to how great is our God. Sing with me. How great is our God. Do you see the problem? And so we have to find a way to separate God from that place so that we can keep our consciences clean when we worship him. Otherwise, we know we're just saying, it's good that you did that, while fearing for our lives inside. So, what do we do then with the God who must be present within hell if hell exists? If this place of fiery eternal torment exists, then a God has to be involved. He has to be sustaining it. He has to be the active, agent behind the suffering of those within its gates. What do we do with the God who exists if that place exists? What do we do with him? I say we send him to hell himself. I say we say to hell with the God of hell. Because a belief in him corrupts everything. Even your worship forces you to confess the evil and the immoral. When you say, how great is our God, and the God you must be singing to is a God who is sustaining a place of torment that you'll condemn ISIS for, you are, even if you're doing it unconsciously, saying that that is good. Every time you worship the God of hell, you are abdicating your morality. It corrupts that. It corrupts you at the very center of your being. You don't even know what's happening, but it does. Even heaven becomes hell if this God exists. Everything this God touches becomes corrupted. And no matter which way you slice it, if you follow this God, it leads you down a path of immorality. In fact, I don't even think, I was listening to an interview with a guy who decided he was going to live a year as an atheist. His name is Ryan Bell. And so he did this sort of thing. He was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, and he was sort of, questioning his faith. And so he decided he was going to blog a year, and he called it A Year Without God, and he was going to try to live a year without God as an atheist, and at the end of it all, see, what he wanted to do. Okay? And so during his year without God, he was being interviewed by these Christian podcasters. And they ask him, they say, well, why stop with a year without God? Why don't you live like a year as a dictator? Why don't you live like a year as a child, molester, or as a year as a serial killer? And he's like, because I'm not a dictator or a pedophile or a serial killer. I'm a moral person. I don't want to be any of those things. That's why I'm not living a year as those things. But in their minds, not believing in the God who will torment you forever if you do such things leads one to do such things. And they said, look, honestly, if I didn't have God and if I didn't have the threat of hell before my eyes, I don't know what I'd become, but I would probably go down a path like that. And he was like, well, I don't have a fear of hell, and I live a very morally upright life. Why? Because he didn't have this fear of hell in his life. Even as a Seventh-day Adventist, he was very progressive, and years before had kind of left that idea behind. He was able to ponder more deeply on why we live morally and why we live a certain way, why versus why we don't live a certain way. But these individuals, their morality, they were stunted in their moral development, because if hell exists, you don't need to think any further beyond that. You don't need to think any, you can stop right there. You live this way, you burn forever. There's no need to think any deeper about the issue. So then what happens when that's removed? Your moral muscles are all atrophied. You don't even have a reason to be an ethical person. See, no matter what, I'm just telling you, no matter how you slice it, if you follow this God, if you worship this God of hellfire and brimstone, in some way it leads you down an immoral path. Even if it's not in life, even if it's just in a heaven where you lose your ability to love and empathize and are forced to confess that which is evil, that which you know in life to be evil, as though it were good. And so what do we do with the God of Jonathan Edwards, who's holding babies over the fires of hell and the tongues of his wrath? What do we do with this God? George MacDonald says this: I love the one God seen in the face of Jesus Christ, but from all copies of Jonathan Edwards' portrait of God, however faded by time, however softened by the use of less glaring pigments, I turn with loathing. Not such a God is he, concerning whom was the message John heard from Jesus, that he is light and in him is no darkness at all. What do we do with this God? We say, to hell with him.